In June of 1993, a logging contractor named Rick Tanner parked his brand new Caterpillar 330 hydraulic excavator. $400,000 worth of machine, 240 horsepower, 65,000 pounds of operating weight. A hydraulic thumb that could crush a car. In front of an oak stump on the Nelson property outside of Frederick, Wisconsin, and spent 4 hours trying to pull it out of the ground. He failed. The stump was a white oak. The tree had been cut the previous winter, a 300-year-old giant that had stood on the Nelson property since before the United States existed. The trunk had been 4 feet across at the base. The stump that remained was 3 feet above ground, and this was the problem, approximately 15 feet across at the root crown, with a root system that spread 40 feet in every direction and went 6 feet deep into the heavy Wisconsin clay. Rick had been hired to clear the stump so Arne Nelson could put the field back into production. Arne was 71 years old and had been farming around that oak his entire life. His father had farmed around it before him. The tree had been a landmark. You gave directions by it. Turn left at the Nelson oak. But the tree had been dying for a decade, dropping limbs, threatening the fence line, and Arne had finally cut it. Now he wanted the stump out. "No problem," Rick had told Arne. "I've pulled 100 stumps with the 330. Biggest one was a 4-foot elm. Took 20 minutes. The Nelson oak was not a 4-foot elm. The Nelson oak was 300 years of root growth, anchored into clay, that hadn't been disturbed since the glaciers left. The root system wasn't just deep, it was interlocked. White oak roots don't grow straight down like a taproot. They spread horizontally, weaving through the soil, gripping rocks and clay layers, creating a mat of wood and earth that functions like a living foundation. Pulling a white oak stump isn't like pulling a post out of the ground. It's like trying to pull a carpet out from under a house. Rick tried the hydraulic thumb first. The 330's arm reached over the stump, gripped it, and pulled straight up. The hydraulics strained. The machine tilted forward on its tracks. 65,000 pounds of excavator physically lifting its rear end off the ground as the arm pulled. The stump didn't move. The roots held. The machine was trying to lift the stump, and the 15 tons of earth the roots were gripping. And that was more than hydraulics could handle. He tried digging, spent 2 hours excavating around the stump, cutting roots with the bucket teeth where he could reach them. He severed a dozen lateral roots, but the primary roots, the big ones, 8 inches thick, running deep under the stump, were below the reach of the excavator bucket. He'd have to dig a hole 15 feet deep around the entire stump to reach them, and the hole would collapse in the heavy clay before he got there. He tried pushing, repositioned the 330, set the bucket against the side of the stump, and pushed. The excavator slid backward on its tracks. The stump held. The root mat was distributing the force across 40 feet of earth. Rick was pushing against a surface area of approximately 1,200 square feet of root-bound soil, and no machine, short of a nuclear device, was going to concentrate enough force to break that grip from one side. At 4 p.m., after 4 hours, Rick shut down the 330 and called Arne. "I can't pull it. The root system is too deep and too spread out. My machine can't reach the bottom roots, and the hydraulics can't overcome the grip. You need to get a bigger excavator or blast it." "How big an excavator?" "Cat 390 or bigger. That's a $600,000 machine, and the nearest one is in Duluth." Transport alone is $3,000. Or we blast it. But you've got a well 200 feet from here and the blast might crack the casing. Arna looked at the stump. 3 feet of oak and 15 feet of roots and 300 years of grip. His father had worked around this tree. His grandfather had cleared the field around it in 1905 by hand, every stump except this one. The oak had been too big to pull even then. 3 generations of Nelsons had farmed around it because no one had ever been able to move it. There might be somebody, Arna said, who's got a bigger machine than a Cat 330. He doesn't have a bigger machine. He has an older one. Let me tell you about Orville Strand, because the machine in his barn is a piece of history, and the man who runs it is a walking textbook on moving things that don't want to be moved. Orville was born in 1928 in Polk County, the son of a Swedish timberman named Gunnar Strand, who had spent his life in the Wisconsin Northwoods, cutting trees and pulling stumps to clear farmland for settlers. Gunnar was one of the last of the old-time stump pullers. Men who understood that removing a tree wasn't about cutting it down. Cutting was the easy part. The stump was the war. In 1930, Gunnar bought a Caterpillar 60, a crawler tractor, one of the earliest track-type machines Cat ever built. 60 horsepower, gas-powered, with steel tracks and a drawbar that could pull 12,000 pounds at a dead crawl. The Cat 60 was designed for logging and land clearing, not farming. It was a stump puller's machine, built heavy, geared low, designed to apply enormous, sustained force at near zero speed. Gunnar used the Cat 60 to clear over 400 acres of Wisconsin hardwood between 1930 and 1955. Oak stumps, maple stumps, elm stumps, some of them bigger than the Nelson oak. He pulled them all, not by lifting, by dragging, and not by brute force alone, by understanding the root system and attacking it strategically, cutting specific roots first, weakening the grip, then applying the crawler's pulling force at the exact angle that would peel the stump out of the ground instead of fighting the full resistance head-on. An excavator lifts, Gunnar told Orville when Orville was 12 years old. A crawler drags. You can't lift a stump because you're trying to lift the stump and the earth it's holding. You have to drag it, pull it sideways at an angle so the roots break one side at a time instead of all at once. An excavator tries to pick up the whole problem. A crawler peels the problem apart. Gunnar died in 1960. Orville inherited the Cat 60, the 160 acres Gunnar had cleared for his own farm, and 30 years of stump pulling knowledge that existed nowhere except in Orville's head. He maintained the crawler the way his father had. New tracks every 15 years, engine rebuilt every 4,000 hours, grease every moving part every week. By 1993, the Cat 60 was 63 years old and still running. The engine had been rebuilt 3 times. The tracks had been replaced 4 times, but the frame, the transmission, the final drives, the bones of the machine were the same ones that had rolled off the Caterpillar factory floor in Peoria, Illinois, in 1930. Orville was 65. He'd pulled stumps his entire life, not as a profession, but as a service. When neighbors cleared land, they called Orville. When the county needed a stump out of a road right of way, they called Orville. When a logging contractor hit something he couldn't move, which happened more than you'd think, they called Orville. He charged $50 to $100 per stump depending on size, and he'd never failed to pull one. Not once in 40 years. Arne Nelson called Orville on a Tuesday evening. "I've got the oak stump. Rick Tanner's Cat 330 couldn't pull it. 4 hours, didn't budge." The Nelson oak. I've been looking at that tree for 50 years. Always wondered when someone would cut it. "Can you pull the stump?" "I can pull the stump." Rick said it would take a Cat 39. Oh, or blasting. Rick's an excavator man. Excavators lift. I pull. Different physics. I'll be there Saturday. Let me tell you about Saturday, because what happened in Arne Nelson's field is a master class in the difference between power and technique. Orville arrived at 7 a.m. on his Cat 60. He'd driven it 2 miles from his farm on the township road. The crawler moved at about 3 miles an hour on pavement, steel tracks clanking, engine chugging, a sound from the 1930s moving through a 1990s landscape. He brought 300 feet of 2-inch steel cable, a collection of chains, a 20-ton snatch block, a splitting maul, and a crosscut saw. Rick Tanner was there. Arne had invited him to watch, partly out of courtesy, and partly because Rick had told Arne it was impossible. Rick brought 2 of his crew. They leaned against the Cat 330, still parked at the site from the failed attempt, and watched Orville set up with the skepticism of men who operated $400,000 machines and were about to watch a $3,000 antique try to do what their machine couldn't. Orville didn't touch the cable first. He walked around the stump for 20 minutes. He probed the ground with a steel rod at various points around the root system, mapping the major lateral roots by feel, pushing the rod until he hit resistance, noting the depth and direction. He was reading the root system the way a surgeon reads an X-ray, building a 3-dimensional picture of what was underground before deciding where to cut. "What's he doing?" Rick asked Arne. "He's figuring out where the roots are." "I could have told him where the roots are. They're everywhere. That's the problem. He's not looking for everywhere. He's looking for the strong ones." Orville identified 4 primary roots. The big ones, 8 to 10 inches thick, running north, south, east, and southeast. These were the anchors. The dozens of smaller lateral roots were secondary. They contributed to the grip, but the 4 primaries were the skeleton. Break those, and the rest would release. He started with the crosscut saw, not a chainsaw, a crosscut, a 5-foot 2-man saw that his father had used in the 1930s. Orville worked it alone, which was a sight in itself. A 65-year-old man pulling a 5-foot saw through green oak root in the mud of a Wisconsin field. Rick's crew stopped leaning on the excavator and walked closer to watch. Orville dug shallow trenches to expose the north and south primary roots at 3 feet from the stump, then cut them with the crosscut. 2 roots severed, an hour of work. He left the east and southeast roots intact. This was the key. He wasn't trying to free the stump entirely. He was weakening it on one side, leaving the other side anchored, so that when the crawler pulled, the stump would pivot on the remaining roots instead of fighting the full grip. Pivot, then tear, one side at a time. "Why isn't he cutting all of them?" Rick asked. Arne smiled. "Ask him." Rick walked over. "Mr. Strand, why are you leaving the east side roots?" "Because if I cut all 4, the stump sits loose in a crater, and the cable has nothing to pull against except dead weight. Dead weight straight up. That's what your excavator tried. It failed, Because you were trying to lift 15 tons of stump and earth. If I leave 2 roots on the east side and pull from the west, the stump pivots on those roots like a lever. The east roots become the fulcrum. I'm not pulling 15 tons. I'm breaking 2 roots at a time and letting the pivot do the work. Rick stared at him. You're using the stump's own roots as a pivot point. My father taught me. You don't fight the whole system. You turn part of the system against itself. Orville rigged the cable. He ran it from the Cat 60's drawbar, through the snatch block anchored to a buried dead man 80 feet west, and back to the west side of the stump, wrapped low around the root crown. The snatch block gave him a 2-to-1 advantage. The pull direction was west, directly opposite the intact east and southeast roots. He climbed onto the Cat 60. The engine was already warm. He'd let it idle while he worked. He engaged the clutch, set the transmission in low, a gear so slow the tracks barely moved, maybe 6 inches per minute, and opened the throttle. The cable came taut. The crawler leaned into the pull. The tracks bit into the earth and gripped. Steel cleats in Wisconsin clay, an embrace of iron and dirt that held while the cable hummed and the snatch block creaked, and 12,000 pounds of drawbar pull doubled through the block to 24,000 pounds, began to bear on the west side of a stump that had been holding the earth for 3 centuries. The stump resisted. Of course it did. The east and southeast roots held like anchors. The stump was being asked to pivot, to rotate on those roots, lifting the west side out of the ground while the east side held. Orville didn't increase the throttle. He didn't panic. He let the crawler pull at its own speed, 6 inches per minute, constant force, constant pressure. The same force that his father had applied to 400 acres of hardwood stumps, patient, relentless, indifferent to time. At 3 minutes, the west side of the stump lifted, 6 inches, a foot. Roots snapped underground. Not the primaries, the secondaries, popping like gunshots as the pivot broke their grip. Dirt cascaded into the hole. The stump tilted east, hanging on its 2 remaining roots like a door on 2 hinges. Orville stopped. He repositioned the cable to the top of the tilted stump, now exposed, now vulnerable, and pulled again, this time east, directly against the remaining roots. The pivot had already stressed them. The clay around them had cracked. They were weakened, isolated, holding alone what 4 roots had held together. The Cat 60 pulled. The cable sang. The east and southeast roots held for 45 seconds, and then broke, both of them, with a sound that Arne Nelson described later as the earth letting go. A deep, wet crack, like a bone breaking underwater, followed by a rush of air and clay as the 300-year-old root system released its grip on the Wisconsin earth. The stump rolled out of the ground, not flew, rolled, slowly, heavily. 15 feet of root crown and 6 feet of taproot and 300 years of wood emerging from the clay like something being born. It rolled onto its side in the field and lay there, root tendrils pointing at the sky, dripping mud, enormous, and finally defeated. The crowd. And there was a crowd by now, 30 or 40 people who'd heard the crawler coming and drove out to watch, cheered. Arne Nelson took his cap off and held it against his chest. His grandfather had worked around this stump in 1905. His father had worked around it for 40 years after that. Arne had worked around it his whole life. And now, at 71, he was looking at a hole where it used to be. Rick Tanner walked to the stump and looked at the root system. The 2 severed north and south roots were clean cuts. the crosscut saw marks visible. The two broken east and southeast roots were torn, raw, splintered, fractured by the pivot force that Orville had engineered. The difference between the cuts and the tears told the whole story. Orville hadn't fought the stump. He'd dissected it. 4 hours with my 330, Rick said. And you did it in, 20 minutes of pulling? 3 minutes the first pull, 45 seconds the second. Call it 4 minutes of actual pulling. But the setup took 2 hours. The pulling is the last thing. The thinking's the first thing. I spent 4 hours pulling. You spent 2 hours thinking and 4 minutes pulling. That's the difference between an excavator and a stump puller. An excavator has power. A stump puller has a plan. Rick looked at the Cat 60, 63 years old, 60 horsepower, worth maybe $3,000 at auction. His Cat 330 was sitting 50 feet away. $400,000, 240 horsepower, the most advanced hydraulic technology in the world. $400,000, Rick said quietly. And your machine is, $3,000. My father paid $4,200 new in 1930. It's depreciated some. Orville smiled. It was the first time anyone had seen him smile all morning. You could have done this with any crawler, though, any tractor with a cable and a snatch block. Probably. But the Cat 60 is geared lower than anything made today. Low does 6 inches a minute. No modern crawler goes that slow. And slow is what you need. Fast pulling snaps cables. Slow pulling breaks roots. My father used to say that a stump doesn't surrender to violence. It surrenders to patience. Let me tell you about the years before and after the Nelson Oak, because Orville's stump pulling service was a quiet legend in Polk County for 40 years. Between 1955 and 1994, Orville pulled an estimated 800 stumps with the Cat 60, oak, maple, elm, ash, pine, anything that had been cut and needed to be removed. Farmers, loggers, county road crews, the DNR, everyone called Orville when the modern equipment failed or when the stump was too big or too stubborn for standard methods. His rate never exceeded $100 per stump. Most jobs were $50 to $75. He didn't advertise. He didn't need to. Word of mouth in a farming county is the most efficient marketing system ever invented. And Orville's record, 800 stumps, 0 failures, spoke for itself. The income wasn't large, maybe $2,000 to $4,000 a year from stump pulling, on top of his farming income from 160 acres of crops and hay. But the stump money was pure profit. The Cat 60 burned about 2 gallons of gas per hour, and most stumps took less than 30 minutes of actual running time once the setup was done. The operating cost was under $5 per stump. The rest was knowledge. Orville also farmed his 160 acres with the Cat 60 and a 1949 Farmall M. The crawler did the heavy work, plowing, clearing, pulling anything that resisted. The Farmall did the row work, planting, cultivating, hauling. Both machines were paid for. Both were maintained by Orville in his barn. His total equipment cost for 40 years of farming was the original purchase prices, $4,200 for the Cat 60 and $1,800 for the used Farmall M, plus parts and maintenance that averaged about $400 a year combined. By 1993, when the Nelson Oak fell, Orville had $89,000 in savings. His 160 acres was paid for. His equipment was paid for. His costs were lower than any farmer in Polk County, and his income was supplemented by a stump-pulling sideline that had been running without interruption since 1955. Let me tell you about the conversation with Rick Tanner's father, because it happened a month after the Nelson Oak, and it's the reconciliation this story needs. Rick's father, Hank Tanner, was a retired logger. He'd been in the timber business for 30 years before Rick took over and modernized with hydraulic equipment. Hank had started with a cable skidder and a two-man crosscut saw. He'd worked alongside men like Gunner Strand in the 1950s, pulling stumps with crawlers and cables and patience. Hank drove to Orville's farm on a Sunday afternoon. He'd heard about the Nelson Oak from Rick, heard about the pivot technique, the crosscut saw, the 4 minutes of pulling that did what 4 hours of hydraulics couldn't. Orville, Hank, my boy says you pulled the Nelson Oak. I did. He says you cut 2 roots and pivoted on the other 2. Your father would have done the same thing. The pivot was standard technique in the 30s. I know. I used to watch my father do it. He'd study a stump for an hour before he put a cable on it. He'd probe the roots with a steel bar, find the primaries, figure out the pivot point. Then he'd cut and pull, and the stump would come out like it wanted to leave. That's how Gunner taught me. I tried to teach Rick. He wasn't interested. He had the hydraulic excavator. The excavator could lift anything. Why would he need an old man's technique when he had 240 horsepower and a hydraulic thumb? Because a hydraulic thumb lifts. Roots don't lift, they pull. I told him that. He said the machines had changed. The machines changed, the roots didn't. Hank looked at the Cat 60 parked in Orville's barn, 63 years old. 60 horsepower. Steel tracks, gas engine, a drawbar, and a cable. The simplest possible machine for the hardest possible job. My son spent $400,000 on a machine that can do 100 things. Your father spent $4,200 on a machine that can do one thing. And when the one thing is the thing that needs doing, the $4,200 machine wins. It's not about the machine, Hank. It's about the man who reads the stump. The machine is the last step. The first step is the walk around. The second step is the rod. The third step is the plan. The fourth step is the cuts. The fifth step, the pulling, is just executing the plan. If your plan is right, any crawler can pull any stump. If your plan is wrong, a $400,000 excavator can't budge it. My father knew that. So did mine. And our sons forgot. They didn't forget. They were never taught. We replaced the knowledge with the machine and assumed the machine would make the knowledge unnecessary. It didn't. It made the knowledge invisible. And when the machine fails, the knowledge is the only thing that can solve the problem. Hank and Orville sat in the barn for an hour. 2 old men talking about stumps and crawlers, and fathers who'd cleared the Wisconsin forests, 1 root at a time. When Hank left, he shook Orville's hand and said something that Orville repeated to his own son later. The best tools in the world won't help you if you've forgotten how to think. Orville retired from stump pulling in 1994, the year after the Nelson Oak. He was 66. His hands were still strong, but his back had given notice. 3 decades of walking rough ground, probing roots, and rigging cables had taken their toll. He passed the Cat 60 to his son, Martin, who fires it up every spring and still takes the occasional stump call from the county. The Cat 60 is 94 years old as of this recording. It's been rebuilt more times than anyone can count. But the frame, the original 1930 frame, stamped with the Peoria serial number, is the same. Martin says the engine sounds different from any modern machine. Deeper, slower, more patient. Like it knows the stump isn't going anywhere, and neither is it. The Nelson Oak stump sits at the edge of Arna's field. Arna didn't burn it or bury it. He left it there as a marker. His grandson mows around it every summer. It's been there since 1993, roots to the sky, a monument to 300 years of growing and one morning of letting go. Let me ask you something. What are you trying to lift that needs to be pulled? Rick Tanner had the most powerful machine in the county. He applied maximum force in the most obvious direction. Straight up. Lift the stump. Overpower the roots. Use hydraulics to defeat 300 years of biology. It didn't work. Not because the machine wasn't strong enough. Because the approach was wrong. You can't outmuscle a root system by lifting against it. The roots pull down. If you pull up, you're fighting the earth itself. Orville approached the same stump with a machine that cost 130 times less. But he didn't approach it with power. He approached it with a plan. Walk the stump. Probe the roots. Find the primaries. Cut two. Pivot on two. Let the stump's own structure become the lever that breaks it free. The difference wasn't horsepower. It was understanding. The difference wasn't the machine. It was the man who read the stump before he pulled it. $400,000 of hydraulic technology. 4 hours, zero movement. $4,200 of 1930 crawler. 4 minutes of pulling. One 300-year-old stump out of the ground. The machine didn't make the difference. The thinking did. And thinking, it turns out, hasn't depreciated in 94 years.